Alright, so this is one of my first 3D videos that I'm going to upload, and the goal I had was just to create some 3D text. A lot of the stuff I do is really mechanical, and I just wanted to create something that was not. The first part of this video is going to go by really quickly. I've recorded the video previously, and I'm now speaking over it, and it's currently running at, I believe, 4x. So I'm just creating some text here. I use the font Slacky from Google Fonts. It's a really good place to find some cool fonts to use. There's nothing really exciting happening here. It's just some 3D type in front of a camera. And again, I'm going to try a few different styles of videos. This is just one of the styles that I'm starting off with, where I sort of run through it at my own pace, and then I'm going to come back in and talk about what I'm doing. So when I started to think about this concept and the word disconnected, I wanted the actual feeling of the type to be disconnected as well. But in that, I wanted it to visually convey that it is disconnected while still looking like a word, not like an art piece, where the letters are just scattered. So what I've got here is I've got each letter broken apart individually, and I've scattered them to the rear in 3D space. So you see CONN is all on the same plane, TED is on the same plane, but the letters DISCO are sort of scattered in 3D space all on their own. I thought that was fine, but then I thought that the word could be distorted a little bit. I'm just playing around with some deformers there. And then I thought, well, I'll just distort each letter individually on its y-axis. And to give some variation, I'm distorting the letter E sort of non-proportionally. I just stretched it out. So the E's look different, which is nice. And I started to create these platforms. I thought that even though the letters are floating in 3D space all on their own, they should still sit on something. And the D has a really sharp edge, so I created a FFD, a freeform deformer, and I just sort of warped the top of this cylinder so that it fits the D a little bit better. And right here, I'm just adjusting each letter individually. At a certain point, I'm going to edit all the letters, and the video slows down considerably at that point because there's a lot more to talk about in terms of technique and the other sort of stuff I'm doing. At this point, I'm just doing a quick test render just to see how things look. Make sure the floor looks okay. Creating a couple lights. At this point, I've got two lights. I've got a spotlight with a target, so it's always going to point at my words. So that the focal point actually is the D and the CONN. That's where the camera is actually going to be focused. I'm going to use a little bit of depth of field in the new physical renderer to accentuate that a little bit, to accentuate the depth that the letters have. So at this point, I'm adjusting my focal plane, forgetting that the camera doesn't actually respect the target object as its focal plane. And in a bit here, I actually go in and correct that. I'm also playing with the aperture of the camera because I want that heavy blur on the letters that are really far behind. But I'm not getting it, and that's because my focal plane isn't being respected by the camera. In a second here, I'll go in and tweak that. So I know something's up, and there we go. I say use target object, at which point you can see the TED getting kind of fuzzy. But it's not fuzzy enough, and I'll come back to that later on. What I end up doing is using a larger film format. My brief time in photography tells me that a large film format along with a low f-stop is going to give you that heavy blur. It's harder to get a heavy blur on smaller sensor sizes, and it's nice that the new Cinema 4D allows you to actually set your film size with some sort of real-world accuracy. So right there we missed it, but I was adding a rounded edge to the cylinders. It's pretty much Cinema 4D 101. It's kind of built in, you get it for free. And I'm just adding some global illumination. It's definitely sort of a trend as of late. It seems like every video or still I see has a heavy dose of GI in it, which is good. And then I'm creating a sky. And I've created a sphere here as a reference object. So I've applied the same texture to the sky and the sphere. That way I can see my changes on a global scale as well as a local scale. And the scene is now nicely tinted. At this point I'm just trying to get some more luminance. I don't think the GI is pronounced enough, but you know, my sky object isn't amazingly bright. I eventually end up trying to apply the same texture to the color and the luminance, but I'm not sure it really had the effect I wanted. I keep it anyway. I'm sort of trying to make up the difference here with the lighting itself. But it's always sort of a balancing act, because the global illumination and the lighting fight each other. You get a lot of nice smooth effects if you use GI, but if you use pure lighting, you don't get many of those transitions, and some of the subtle shading gets washed out. I'm just tweaking the gradient here some more in the sky. So at this point, my composition is pretty much set. This is what I want it to look like, and I'm using the physical render to preview it here. At this point, I'm saying to myself, alright, how can I get the depth of field to be a little deeper and more prominent? I'm also thinking to myself what the letters are going to look like in terms of their texture. I decided I want it to be a shiny, soft looking material. So here I'm editing the text individually as polygons. And this is where I've slowed the video down quite a bit. I figured the easiest way to make the letters smooth was by using hypernerbs or subdivision surfaces. And in order to do that, the geometry has to be a little bit nicer. All those green lines you're seeing are n-gons. They're just sort of the quadrangle and triangle interpretation of a shape that has way more than 4 sides. And for the hypernerbs object to do its job, you need some semblance of clean geometry near the edges. So I've done an extrude inner, and I'm just sort of moving the polygons around trying to get that edge. And eventually I add a hypernerbs object, change its mode. And here we can see that I'm sort of getting stuff to look the way I want it. But the minute I let the smoothing loose, you start to see some artifacts. So I'm going to go back in and do another extrude inner. And the hope is that it's going to patch that transition up so you don't see the rough edges as much. At this point I like the result, but I wanna cut the hull. So the hull would be the part of these letters that is stretched as the type is extruded. So I guess the best way to say it is the hull is the part that I'm cutting, but you can define the hull as the part of the object that is not considered one of the caps. So I'm putting a couple cuts in the hull of these letters, just to give the hypernerbs a little bit more to work with. It helps smooth out the transition, it sort of tightens up the edges. It's still going to look nice and smooth on the edge, but this way it won't look so sloppy. Let's put it that way. At that point I noticed that the letter N's are getting some serious artifacting. This is because of their extreme acute angles. And at first I go in with sort of point modification and try to tweak that. It works okay. And then later on you'll see that I'm just not happy with it. So I go back in and I add a bevel, but we're not there yet. I have some overlapping geometry here, very ugly. And once I fix the overlap, I'm using the move along edge tool to move those points. It won't let me select the point unless it's not overlapping. That's kind of an issue. But then once I move the points out from under each other, I just use the move along edge tool. Now I'm switching to the brush. The brush tool is pretty nice. There's a couple different modes, and I'm using the smooth mode right now. Think of it like a simplistic ZBrush, where you have a brush with intensity and fall off and all the other aspects of computerized brushes. And then you can use that to modify points, either by pulling, pushing, smoothing. At this point I'm using smooth. So all it does is it sort of interpolates the point position iteratively. So I have my strength at 2%. So I can just run the brush over the points a few times and it sort of smooths it out. And I can see the effect as it's happening, and it also allows me to do it to 10, 12, 15 points at once. It's a nice little trick I use in my modeling. So yeah, just geometry cleanup. Nothing really exciting here, but there's a lot of technique in here, and I hope some of you guys appreciate this. If you don't, let me know, and I won't spend so much time on it next time. If you appreciate it, let me know, and I'll spend more time on it. There's a lot of modeling technique I've learned over the years, and some of it might be less useful to you, and other parts of it might be pretty interesting, but the magic part of that equation is that I don't know, so you gotta let me know. So at this point the ends look possible. I don't love them, but they're okay. And then I see that the artifacting is pretty bad down in the creases, and that's to be expected with HyperNerbs. So the fix for that is just to add more geometry. So at this point I'm going in with my edge mode, and I'm essentially selecting the crease. Selecting those edges where the crease happens. And I'm using the bevel tool just to split the edges into two and round them off. This does two things. It adds more geometry, and it also creates a more easily understandable transition for the software. So instead of your edge going from 60 degrees all the way down to 50 degrees, and well, the difference of that, and it being such a sharp crease, it actually has a transition to work with. And what used to be one edge becomes two edges, and the software can figure it out a little bit easier. Not as if you can fool it, it just does what you ask it to do, which is nice. So at this point I'm thinking to myself, okay, I have the geometry pretty squared away. Let's work on the texturing some more and just get the render to look good. I still have that shiny white material that I created earlier, and I'm just sort of tweaking the render at this point. Going into the material, and I thought orange would look good. That's what I settled on. As you can see, I didn't really spend much time tweaking that. And then I wanted the floor to be a little bit sort of brighter, so I gave it some luminance. I just ramped its color up past a 100% value. And I like this. I like the fact that the floor is mostly all white, but at the same time it still has some shading and shadows in there. That's really the effect I wanted. And I go back in and play with the sky a little bit. At this point I'm just letting the the progressive render crank away, and then I have something I like, so I give it a shot, let it render. This render took a couple minutes. This part is sped up, as the rest of the video is, and we can see here that it's just over a minute. I think it came in at 2 minutes maybe. The white parts and the edges are really quick, so we're coming up on 2 minutes. Yeah, just about 2 minutes.